Well, we're gonna talk about something today that at first glance might not seem all that relevant to you. I think we've titled the message, "What in the world is an elder?" But you're gonna find today that it's a lot more relevant than you think, especially as we move into the second half of our talk today. I was out golfing with a gentleman yesterday who is a newer pastor to the Valley, and he's pastoring a very historic church here in the Valley, and I asked him how it was going, and he just mentioned something about the topic here today where he's having to work through what we call church governance with an existing system, and he wants it to move to a more biblical system. And of all the things you could tell me of the first year of how it's going in his pastorate and trying to move, upwards of 1,000 people in a certain direction, the number one thing on his mind is the topic that we're going to talk about today. Because as you're going to see, it really is an important topic that, quite frankly, Christians have made a veritable mess of in the last 2,000 years. And hopefully today we're going to walk out of here in about 45 to 50 minutes with some clear understanding of this topic before us. And the topic has to do with elders. Now, before I dive into the elder topic, we might have some fun with this. I'm sure you've all noticed this. Wikipedia actually has an article on the fact that Christians today have their own language. If you type into Wikipedia, Christianese, kind of like Chinese, Japanese, type in Christianese, there'll actually be a whole article on the fact that Christians have their own language. Let me read for you directly from this article. It says, Christianese refers to terms and jargon used within many branches and denominations of Christianity as a functional system of religious terminology. It is characterized by the use of everyday conversation of certain words, theological terms, and catchphrases in ways that may only be comprehensible within the context of Christian belief. What are they saying? We have our own language. That just like if you're on an airplane trying to listen to somebody speaking in Mandarin or something like that, or Cantonese, and you wouldn't understand a word they're saying that sometimes when people hear Christians talk, they have no idea what we're talking about. And you're saying, like what? Well, here's some of the words I've noticed over the years. Anointed, backsliding, the blood, born again, courting, discipleship, even the fact that we call each other brother and sister. I was watching the Godfather movie the other day, and Michael Corleone introduced Tom Hagen as, my brother Tom Hagen, and she goes, he doesn't look like your brother. Well, my parents took him in, and, we take the word brother to mean literally, but Christians use that term to mean it in a very figurative sense as a brother in Christ. And so I ran across an article a few years back that just made me laugh out loud in my office that kind of gave some Christian phrases and what we really mean by them. So Christianese would be let's fellowship together, translated let's go get some food, right? Christianese would be the Lord works in mysterious ways, translated I have no idea what God is up to. Christianese would be I don't feel led to do that. This is my favorite. Translation, you can't make me. Christianese would be bless her heart. You ever heard somebody say that? Bless her heart. Translated, what an airhead. I challenge you to look at every time somebody says, oh, bless his heart, we're saying he's an idiot. Christianese, that's not my spiritual gift. Translation, find someone else. And so people hear us talk, and we have all these phrases, and we know what they mean, but they don't. So here's the deal. As we continue on in our study of 1 Peter, Dave mentioned we're going into chapter 5 now. Peter's going to start a discussion on what we call elders. And if ever that was a Christianese word, elder is. Before I became a Christian, I never heard somebody use the word elder except maybe my grandmother would have said, you need to respect your... And all she meant by that was somebody older than me. But even by the time it hit my mom and my dad, who were born in the 30s, they weren't using that phrase anymore. I don't think they ever said respect your elders. That was really like a 19th century term. But the Bible uses the word elder, all the time. And get this, I think some of you know this, it uses the term elder in an extremely significant, life-giving, way that affects every one of us greatly. So, what is an elder as Peter leads us into our discussion? Here's a working definition of an elder, as well as our main point this morning, and that is that an elder is a biblically qualified leader, sometimes older than you, sometimes not, who shepherds the church by protecting, leading, feeding, and caring for her. That's what an elder is. And some of you might even be looking at that definition saying, talk about Christianese, you're using a term like shepherd. Again, who uses that term today? Well, I thought about changing that term when I did this study a few years back, but the word shepherd, as you're going to see here in a second, is needed in this definition because it comes directly from the Scriptures. So our passage before us today is 1 Peter chapter 5, verses 1 and 2. And the reason we need to have an intelligent discussion on elder leadership as far as the church goes today, men, is because this is exactly where Peter leads us. So look at what he says. He says, "So I exhort the elders among you, as a fellow elder and a witness of the sufferings of Christ, as well as a partaker in the glory that is going to be revealed, shepherd the flock of God that is among you, exercising oversight, not under compulsion, but willingly, as God would have you, not for shameful gain, but eagerly." Now, we know from the context here that this word elder cannot be referring simply to somebody who's older. The New Testament sometimes will use the word elder that way. Timothy uses it when he just says, show respect to those who are older. But here, we have every evidence that this word elder is being used for an office, a leadership position within the church. It's the Greek word presbyteros, where we get the word Presbyterian from. So any of you have a Presbyterian background, this is the Greek word presbyteros. And we know that it's referring to an office or position because it's used that way so many other times in the Scriptures when it's talking about things like this. So for instance, in Acts chapter 14, verse 23, it tells us that they appointed elders in each of the churches they had planted, and they weren't just older people, because Timothy, who was young, we have evidence, was appointed, or even a part of appointing elders. And so you have this leadership position or this office of an elder, and what is it that they are primarily to do? They are to shepherd the flock of God among you. That's why we have to keep that word there, shepherd it. Obviously, the word picture here, and I have a picture up here on the screen, is from an agrarian culture that in which just as a shepherd back then, and even today, would provide and care for a flock of sheep, so what God is saying is that there's certain leaders within the church that are supposed to care for and protect the flock of God. And the question becomes like, well, how does that work? I mean, some churches are large, some are big, some have certain flavors, some don't. I mean, is this really true for every church? It really is. And so for years, I've kind of carried this image in my mind that if you're a small church, you're probably going to have just a few elders because there's only a few sheep. But if you're a large church like Scottsdale Bible Church, maybe there on the right, where you have a lot of sheep, you still need elders. It's just that how they accomplish their role, how they function, is going to come about a little differently. They won't always be hands-on, but the charge or the role of an elder will be the same. You're saying, well, what's that? There are four things, both confirmed here in 1 Peter 5 as well as in other parts of the Bible, that are core to what it means to be an elder. Four roles that the elders play in overseeing a particular church, four traits that are contained really in what it means to be an elder. Let me walk you through those, and then I'm going to show you in the second half of our time today why I believe elder leadership in the local church is the biblical pattern of leadership when even contrasted to some other forms that are out here today. But first, let's understand elder. An elder protects. An elder protects the flock. It's interesting, in the book of Acts, Paul the Apostle had been staying with the church in Ephesus, again, working with the elders there that they had appointed to lead the church. And as he's just about ready to leave the church on the shores of the sea there in Ephesus, it says this in verses 28 to 31 of Acts 20. He says to the elders, "Be on guard for yourselves and for all the flock, among which the Holy Spirit has made you overseers to shepherd the church of God, which he purchased with his own blood. I know that after my departing, savage wolves will come in among you, not sparing the flock. And from among your own selves men will arise, speaking perverse things, to draw away the disciples after them. Therefore, be on alert, remembering that night and day for a period of 3 years I did not cease to admonish each one with tears." What blows me away about this passage more than anything, men, and I know some of you caught it, is that Paul is warning the elders that threats will arise from without and from within the church. What we might call friendly fire, what Marshall Shelley calls well-intentioned dragons. And any of you who have been around the church for any length of time know that there's actually threats that arise even from well-meaning sheep. Sheep can come at each other. They can even come at the shepherd. They can kind of be sheep. And the fact is that elders are called to be on guard, to be on alert. They are to protect. And so at my church, Scottsdale Bible Church, which has a very strong form of elder leadership, our elders spend a concerted amount of time talking about doctrinal issues. So we spent an hour the other day in one of our after-hour meetings, which is a meeting where we don't have our pastors there, but just the elders, talking about a key doctrinal issue that we're concerned about for our church. That's the role of an elder. They spend lots of time in prayer, praying for the protection and future of a church. They spend time dealing with ministry and people difficulties, mediating disputes, dealing with ministries that need help and guidance. In fact, the general rule of thumb at my large church is that if the pastors are going to make any major strategic change in the church, it has to be approved by the elders. It has to be run by them. Because why? The elders are called to protect the church. And as I've said to my elders, even if they're just looking over our shoulder and giving either a head nod or a head no, that's the role of an elder, to protect. And so it will go without saying that they need to know the word, they need to be very mature and wise in order to do that. Notice the second thing an elder does, and that is that an elder leads. In 1 Timothy 5, verse 17, Paul could not be more clear to Timothy. He says, "Let the elders who rule well be considered worthy of double honor, especially those who work hard at preaching and teaching." So at the very least, elders are to rule the church, not in some lording over you way, but certainly as servant leaderships. But that word rule there in the original Greek literally means to stand over, to have charge, to manage. So it carries with it the idea that you are effectively guiding an organization or a group of people. So again, elders at any biblically functioning church are the ones involved in making strategic decisions. They decide what ministries to start or not to start, what staff to hire or not to hire. They should be the ones to approve yearly direction of the church when it comes to evangelism, discipleship, spiritual growth, spiritual formation. I take this so seriously that I will go away for a couple weeks. Well, I'm going away for more long than that, but a couple weeks of summer I'll be working on my preaching calendar for 2015. And when I get back late this summer, I will run my preaching calendar by our elder board at my church. And I'll just say, hey guys, does everything seem copacetic? Does this seem like where God would have us go? Is this, feel right to you? And though we don't take a vote, that would be a bit controlling. There's no motions and second motion and things like that. It's accountability to say you guys are the ones who are leading our church. Just like a literal shepherd makes lots of decisions about sheep, like what pastures to graze in, what water holes to try, what rivers to forge, what sheep to give personal attention to, this is what elders do in the lifeblood of the church. And then notice me thirdly that an elder feeds the church. They feed. 1 Timothy 3 verse 2 says, "An overseer or elder then must be able to teach." Now, let me be really careful with this one, because this does not necessarily mean, though in some churches it does mean this, but it doesn't necessarily mean that the elders need to be the ones who give the weekly sermons. There's been some confusion on that. If you look very closely here at 1 Timothy 3, it says an overseer must be able to teach. And so in some church contexts, they have elders that give weekly sermons, and that's absolutely legitimate. But there's other contexts where what we're basically saying is that there might be a pastor or somebody with the spiritual gift of teaching or preaching who does the teaching, and not all elders have that gift. But the elders, at the very least, need to know the word and be able to communicate it clearly to the congregation, especially when asked a question or when anybody has concern. Jesus said at one point in his life on this earth that man does not live on bread alone, but by every word that proceeds out of the mouth of God. An elder is somebody who gets that, lives this, and directs others in that way. So again, in my church, we don't look for somebody that has to have the spiritual gift of teaching to be an elder, but they have to be able to teach, to impart biblical truth to those around them. And then lastly, an elder provides care. James 5, verse 14 says it this way in the NASB. Is any among you sick? Let him call for the elders of the church, and let them pray over him, anointing him with oil in the name of the Lord. So again, this and many other passages talk about the fact that elders care for the flock. They provide prayer. They provide compassion, counseling, practical acts of kindness, even speaking truth into people's lives. I love it when somebody will say to me once in a while, I went to see an elder on this, and boy, they offended me. They just said this or this or this to me. What right do they have to say that to me? I love it when people, that's like setting up the T-ball for me right there. Because based on our conversation here today, men, what right does an elder have to speak into somebody's spiritual life within their congregation? Every right. Some of you wonder why membership is important in the church, especially when the Bible doesn't talk about it, because the Bible doesn't say you have to be a member formally of a church. Barely even talks about membership. The logic behind membership is that if you have a well-run biblical structure of leadership in which you have what we call a multiplicity of elders, the reality is that membership is simply you voluntarily saying, I place myself under the authority of these godly men. I trust them. I know they love me. And heaven forbid there should come a time when they have to speak into my life. But if and when that happens, I have already made the choice to place myself under their authority so that I'm never one of those guys that says, why did so-and-so say this to me? The reality is because they're an elder. They oversee the church, to use the biblical term. So are you starting to see through these four things? Elders are called to shepherd the flock of God. And just like an old-time agrarian shepherd with real sheep, an elder today does this through protecting, leading, feeding, and caring for the sheep in his fold. Elders within individual local churches are the spiritual leaders of the church. Now, I want to address an issue that is, I just worked on this last night. This was not a part of my original discussion on elders when I did this a few years ago at my church. But I want to address an issue with you men that has come on my radar lately. And here's the issue, that once you understand what an elder is, what we just walked through here, what do you do about these other competing forms of church government that are out there? And you're saying, what are you talking about? The guy I was talking to yesterday from this church here in the Valley has what we call a congregational form of church government. You're going to see that outlined here in just a minute. But a congregational form of church government basically says, you never want to give like 10 men the power. You never want to give them, just give the whole congregation, kind of like one big happy America, the power to run the church. And that's the system that he's in. And the reason I said that this talk is so important is here you got a guy who's a very gifted young leader, come to us from California, pastoring a very potent historical church here in Phoenix. And after being here a year, the number one thing impeding him from leading is this wacky form of church government that he happens to be in right now. And his number one goal is to try to get it to an elder-led form of government. So what gives with that? What are some of these other forms of church government, and why are they not, what I would argue, and I want to be humble how I say this, why are they not the most biblical? Before I walk you through the three major forms of church government and why I think elder leadership is the only way to go, I want to make two brief caveats that are kind of important. First, is that each of the views I'm going to present to you right now do claim New Testament origin, And in their own way, I guess I would argue that they are semi-workable, or they wouldn't have survived the hundreds of years that they might be around. So I have a distant respect for these views, but at the same time, I don't think, as you'll see in a second here, that they are the ones that are the core biblical views of leadership. But they have been around for a long time, and there have been plenty of godly churches and godly men who have made them work. That would be my first caveat. The second caveat I would give, however, is that you're going to see in a second here that all three views of church government that are out there cannot all be right at the same time. In other words, they are three rather mutually exclusive ways of running church. I've never run into a church that would say, we're elder-led and bishop-led. Or we're congregation-led and bishop-led, or we're congregation-led and elder-led. No, it usually, because they're such distinct views, you have one of the three. And so the real issue is, for you and me this morning, is as we look at all three of these, which is the most biblical? Not which one do we like the best, not which one fits our culture the best, not which one coincides with the church I grew up in, so it makes me feel kind of comfortable best. Not that stuff. Get that out of your mind. Because the reality is, at the end of the day, the Lord is going to hold you accountable in your theology for that which you think fits the biblical evidence the best. Do you guys understand that? So try to get your church history, all this stuff out of your mind, because what matters is what the Bible says. So here's the first one. And I don't have a PowerPoint for this, so you're just going to have to follow along with me, but it's really not rocket science. The first model of church government is what we call a bishop or pastor-led model of church government. So let me just be candid. If you were raised in an Anglican church or a Roman Catholic church or even various independent Bible churches, similar to mine, but mine's not this, you will be familiar with this style of government. It's on both the Protestant as well as the Catholic side. And to give you a clear definition of a bishop or pastor-led form of church government, here it is. It's a single person has all or most of the authority. He or she, I guess, is the principal officer or leader, and everything falls under them. The distinctives of this view is that the church is ruled by a single person. What that person said goes. That person is usually not chosen by the congregation, but appointed by other authorities, like within an Anglican or Catholic system. It's bishops who appoint bishops, cardinals who appoint popes, and things like that. And the authority, the key here is the authority really rests in one single person who might or might not have other people over them because there's hierarchical systems, but the singularity is the key to a bishop or what we might call pastor-led church or congregation. And what you need to know is that outside of what I think is the New Testament's way of doing church government, this form of government is one of the earliest forms of government within the history of the Christian church. In other words, we can detect or trace this form of government all the way back to beginning somewhere between the 2nd, 3rd, or 4th century A.D., and it has been given prominence here in America, believe it or not just through Roman Catholicism, but also through the rise of many independent African American churches. Tony Evans, in his book, What White Christians Need to Know About Black Christians, talks about, that's his book, talks about the fact that in the average black church in America today, they have a model of what he calls the pastor king. And some of you who have ever been in black churches know that. I spent 9 years in Detroit with plenty of fellow black pastors. And in the African American church, I mean, it's just, they have one pastor, and that pastor is the king, and the wife is the first lady. And all the authority and all the leadership falls upon that pastor. I had a good Catholic friend of mine in Detroit who once said to me, he said, the only difference between us and them is that they have 1 million popes because they have 1 million churches like that. But they have a bunch of little area churches that are ruled by these, what you might call a monarchical bishop that are running the church. Why do they believe this church government? Why would they give one person the authority here? Well, there's some scriptural evidence. Matthew 16, verse 18 is a popular passage some of you have heard, in which Jesus is speaking, and he says, "And also, I also say to you that you are Peter," he's referring to the Apostle Peter, "and upon this rock I will build my church, and the gates of Hades shall not overpower it. I will give you the keys of the kingdom of heaven, and whatever you bind on earth shall be bound in heaven, and whatever you loose on earth shall be loosed in heaven." And so some people see Jesus here setting up what they call a monarchical episcopacy, a single leader. And so they argue, there it is. There's the scriptural evidence for the first pope, and there's a scriptural evidence on the Protestant side for why you need to have a single pastor lead the congregation. The only problem is there are numerous problems with that interpretation of this passage. I mean, the first question we have to ask, and this is one that commentators all ask, is that when Jesus says, "Upon this rock I will build my church," is he referring to Peter or himself? I mean, Jesus referred himself as the firm foundation and the rock. They referred him in the epistles as the cornerstone. So when he says that you are Peter, and then he says, "And upon this rock I will build my church," some commentators wonder, well, he could be referring to Peter or Jesus in that scenario. Second issue with this passage is that when he says, "I give you the keys of the kingdom," is that a spiritual authority or a ruling authority? I mean, is Jesus setting up church government there or giving more of a spiritual authority? Third problem is that there's no mention at all of passing this down to others. I mean, if it is given to Peter, it seems to be given to Peter, nothing mentioned about passing it to others. And probably the most problematic for those who use this passage to defend a single bishop form of leadership is that Jesus gave this exact same authority to all 12 apostles, the 12 disciples, not just to Peter in the Gospel of John. So the reality is that if you argue, well, that's your argument for single leadership, all of a sudden now it was given to 12 people as single leaders. It just doesn't seem to make sense. And this is one of the primary passages that people point to defend the idea of a bishop-led form of church government. Other people have pointed to other passages to try to defend it. They point to 1 Timothy 3:2 and Titus 1:7, where it says an overseer must be, and then it's using the word overseer there as singular. And so they say, see, there's a singular sense. But there's too many other passages in the Bible that clearly talk about the fact that there was a multiplicity of elders and overseers in each local church. So just because it uses it in one context as a singular to describe that person's character trait, that does not mean that that there were a bunch of these singular leaders. And then some people say, well, hey, Jamie, it's the oldest form of church government. I mean, it dates all the way back, at the very least, to the 2nd century or the 3rd century, depending on how you look at church history. Well, that is true. But then we have to ask ourselves, why did they do that in the 2nd century? I mean, why did the 2nd century, in my opinion, go against biblical standards in having this bishop singular approach to church government? And when you study church history back at that time, it becomes pretty clear why they did it. Things were absolutely out of control at that time. Tons of persecution, living in catacombs, lots of heretical theological views. Morality was out of control, even within the church. And so when things are like that, it's much easier, instead of trying to get 12 men to agree on something, it's much easier for one guy to kind of come in and say, let's have a one-person leadership because somebody's got to run this show. And I think that's a lot of what happened back in the times of the 2nd, 3rd, and 4th century that led to the bishop model. It was a pragmatic decision, not as much a biblical decision. Again, I know I'm being kind of forward here in my discussion with you guys. I have respect for this system. I don't think it's the most biblical system. So I would challenge people to look at the elder-led system if they come from that background. A second style of church government that I think is even harder to defend, and it only occurs on the Protestant side of things, is what we call a congregational form of church government, congregational form of church leadership. So if you come from a congregational church, a Brethren church, a Mennonite church, even many, many forms of Baptist church, I'm an ordained Baptist minister, you are familiar with this form of church government. And basically their mantra is the opposite of the bishop form, their point is that equal authority within the church must be spread to all the members. So kind of like diffusing everything out as much as possible, that's what they argue. It's a democratic form of church government. That should be our first clue, where the majority of the members rule and they all have equal authority. So what are distinctives of this view? Most of these churches are autonomous in nature. That's why most Baptist churches are autonomous. They have no other authority above them because their authority lies solely in the membership. The authority lies with the many, and so most decisions, if you've ever been in a congregational form of church government, almost all decisions occur at the church meeting, whether it be an annual church meeting or a quarterly church meeting. I was in this, by the way, I was in this form of church government 10 years, and so I'm very familiar with it. Usually, they elect various leaders, so it's kind of deceptive. Congregational forms of church government will have deacons. Sometimes they will even have elders, so you'll find some Baptist churches that have elders, but unless they've really changed their governing documents, if you look close, what they elect elders and deacons to do is to oversee administrative and daily affairs of the church, but they are always under the authority of the congregation. And they are more functioning as a representative form of the congregation, kind of the opposite of the bishop form this whole thing is. Though this form of church government claims biblical support, and I'll give you what they claim here in a minute, it actually dates back to the time of the Reformation. Historically, we know exactly when a congregational form of church government appeared. It appeared in the early 1600s in Western Europe with the rise of the Anabaptist movement that came out of the Reformation. They were frustrated with what they saw as the authoritarian abuses of the Pope. They were frustrated with what they saw as the early abuses of a Calvinistic, elder-led Reformation form of church government. And so as a response to that, it actually was formed with a guy named John Smyth, S-M-Y-T-H. He was the founder of the English Baptist movement, and he was the first to formally come up with a congregational form of church government. So we know it's about a 500-year, maybe 400 or 500-year old form of church government that was kind of a reaction to the abuses of the other two. But what do they point to biblically? Well, they point to 1 Peter 2, 5 and 9, in which it says that we as believers are a holy priesthood, a royal priesthood, a holy nation, a people for God's own possession. The only problem is that in 1 Peter there, and we don't have time to look at it in length, we did earlier in this series, Peter isn't talking about church government there. I mean, not at all. He's talking about the fact that Dave Cavan is a royal priesthood. Dave, as an Old Testament priest, can go directly to God through Jesus. Dave can go and confess his own sins before God, just like he had to use a priest in the Old Testament. That's what it means when it says that we're a royal priesthood. It's not talking about church government there at all. So the point of that passage it doesn't have a lot of teeth. Sometimes they'll point to Acts chapter 6, where the apostles wanted to teach and pray, so they appointed deacons, or even just servants, to handle some of the disputes among the people. And they say, see, it's congregational form of church government. And I say, well, yeah, I mean, they did, delegate some authority there, but it was to, mediate disputes. It wasn't necessarily to set up some full-blown congregational form of church government. I don't know. I find very little biblical support for this. In fact, it's really hard to prove it biblically, but I'm empathetic to why it started. And as I'm going to talk about in just a second before we wrap up here, I will tell you that when you have been abused by elders, or if you've been abused by a single bishop or pastor, you do see why you might want to opt for congregationalism. I'm empathetic to that. I don't know if I do that, but I'd probably just try to get better elders or a better pastor. But I can understand why people would say it might be better just to diffuse the authority here. I think one of the reasons Congregationalism still survives today, by the way, as a quick side note, is because it just collates so well with democracy, doesn't it? And I fight this all the time in my church. My church is an elder-led church, but we have some smatterings of Congregationalism in our form of church government. Biblically speaking, elders appointed elders, end of story. In my system right now, elders are a part of appointing other elders subject to the approval of the congregation. And I'm okay with that. I can work around that, and I'm not going to fight that. But, you know what? That plays to an American audience that gets to vote all the time. And so we think it's wonderful. We think that's what God would want. Biblically speaking, you can't defend that at all. I mean, there's none of that in the New Testament. It's just not, it's foreign to that way of thinking. It's democracy. And I think that's one of the reasons people like this stuff. So obviously, I believe in an elder form of church government. I just think that the biblical evidence, guys, is everywhere. I mean, in addition to 1 Peter chapter 5, you have Acts 14:23. They appointed elders in every church. Having prayed with fasting, they commended them to the Lord. 1 Timothy 5:17, let elders who rule be well considered worthy of double honor. 1 Peter 5, the passage we're here today, to the elders among you. Acts 15, verse 2, when Paul and Barnabas had that awful dispute in which they were arguing over John Mark. Who did they go to in Jerusalem? Do you remember? They went to the apostles and the elders in Jerusalem. Acts chapter 20, Paul is with the elders on the shores of Ephesus. I think clearly the pure New Testament form of church leadership was that each individual congregation had their own set of elders who were godly, mature, non-reactionary, biblically qualified leaders who were charged with protecting, feeding, leading, and caring for the flock of God. That's what an elder is. And I think that system tends to work best. Now, before we pause for questions, I know what some of you might be thinking. You're thinking, well, gosh, Jamie, I mean, that could be a system that's just ripe for abuse. I mean, all you need is 10 elders that are power hungry and kind of, collaborate among themselves, and the church is just going to go to hell in a handbasket. And I would say two things in response to that. I'd say, one, you're right. If that happens, if you have 10 elders that really don't love God or don't know how to lead or what have you, I mean, the church is going to be a mess. Speed of the leader, speed of the team. But I would say if that's your argument against elders, then doesn't that go for bishop-led as well? I mean, if it takes 10 elders to take a church down, but you're bishop-led or pastor-led, all it takes is one of those to take the church down. So I'd much rather, if you will, I'm speaking candidly now, gamble with 10 or 12 that we can at least get a majority of pretty good ones there, than to bank it all on one who has the power to take it all down. If that's your logic, then that. Or, I've known entire congregations that are cursed. How about you? I mean, one of the reasons I don't like congregational form of government is because I actually pastored a church a few years back when I was first going to the senior pastorate, in which I really believed they were under the discipline of the Lord for a lot of decisions that they had made as a congregation. And I actually transitioned that church. It was one of my acts of leadership. I was only there 2.5 years, but I helped transition their governing documents from a Baptistic congregational form of government to an elder-led form of government, because I felt like the congregation had so let God down in the decisions. Remember back in the Old Testament when they all voted to have a king, and God said, you don't want a king. I mean, just because majority rules, that's not a good thing. You see, I know churches today that are like that. So I'm not trying to, I'm not power hungry. I submit to my elders. I'm just saying, if your argument is, well, you can have a bad elders, well, that's the same argument you can use for any form of church government. So here's the deal, guys. Abuse is not the issue. Whether one form of church government can become abusive or not, because they all can become abusive, is not the issue. As I said earlier, the issue is twofold. Is the form of church government that you vie for biblical? Can you prove it biblically? Because that's the linchpin. And whatever form of church government you have, do you have godly and proven people as the ones who are leading? Doesn't that seem to make sense? One of the things I do love about my church, and again, I didn't make any of it, so I can brag about it. I just happened to fall into it 7 years ago, is that we are highly selective about elders. We have about 2,000 male members at our church. We have more people that attend, but we have 2,000 male members. And every year when we are adding 3 or 4 more elders to replace the 3 or 4 that go off, it's a 4-year term, we have a nominating committee made up of 2 sitting elders, and one is the chairman of the nominating committee, one's the vice chairman, because elders select elders. But then it's complemented by 5 lay people, 2 women, 3 men, and then it's also sat on that by myself and our executive pastor. So 9 people are involved in the nominating committee. We go through every name of every male member in our church, and we select about 20 or 30 of the creme de la creme who have shown themselves, according to 1 Timothy 3 and Titus chapter 1, to be men above reproach, able to teach, proven themselves in leadership, mature, non-reactionary, and then we present those 20 or 30 men to the elders. We just did this in our last meeting. And the elders then select the top 3 or 4 out of that, or who they feel God is leading them to be the next elders. And then, as I said earlier, our system is that we would then present them to the congregation for an affirmation vote. That's just the way that we function. But I got to tell you, it takes about 5 or 6 months to do elder selection in our church every year, and it's a highly protected process in which we assure that at the very least these are godly called men to lead the church. And all I can say is that makes me feel good. There's accountability within it. It seems to be very biblical, and it's really served us well. So, last thought. If you're not in many of you are Scottsdale Bible guys, but if you're not and you go to another church and they don't have elders, I'm not telling you today to leave your church. That's not what I'm saying. But what I am saying is that as you develop and form your own theology about church leadership, this is an important issue. And so as you think about that and pray about that yourself, give a lot of thought to what the Bible says about church leadership and what you feel works best within the context of the church.